I heard them decide my fate through a door that was not fully closed, its heavy oak leaving a sliver of space just wide enough for the sound of my life being bartered away. It was my brother, Julian, his voice a low, urgent murmur laced with the kind of desperation that curdled the air. "Use her to settle the debt, Father. Blackwood wants the estate, but a wife would sweeten the deal. Rosamond is too fine for him, too vibrant for that cold mausoleum he calls a home. But Eleonora, she is plain, she is quiet. She would suit his grief." My father's reply was a sigh, a sound like dry leaves skittering across flagstones, the sound of acquiescence. I did not move. I stood in the dim, cold hallway of our crumbling ancestral home, a ghost in my own life, and felt the last vestiges of my insignificant self dissolve into the shadows. They were not wrong. I was Eleonora, the second daughter, the afterthought. Where my sister Rosamond was a sunbeam, all golden curls and laughter that could charm birds from the trees, I was the quiet shade beneath the yew. My worth had always been measured in my stillness, in my ability to fade into the wallpaper so as not to detract from Rosamond's brilliance. My hair was the color of autumn dusk, my eyes a sober gray, and my hands were more comfortable with the brittle pages of a book than with the silken threads of an embroidery hoop. I was the keeper of the household accounts, the silent librarian of my father's neglected collection, the one who knew which floorboards groaned and which windows rattled in the wind. I was a creature of utility, not beauty, and it seemed my final utility had been determined. I was to be a coin, a token, a human ledger entry to balance my family's ruinous accounts. The Duke of Blackwood was a name spoken in hushed tones throughout the county, a man forged from tragedy and iron will. His wife had died a year past, a loss so profound it was said to have extinguished all the light from his formidable estate and from his heart. He was now Lord Alistair Beaumont, a man of immense wealth and influence, and, most pressingly, our primary creditor. My father, a man whose ambition had always outstripped his sense, had gambled away our fortune, borrowing heavily against our lands from the Duke's own bank. Now the note was due, and we were destitute. The Duke was coming not as a guest, but as a proprietor coming to inspect his new acquisition. My family, in their last desperate gambit, intended to offer him a bride as part of the settlement. They would present him with the dazzling Rosamond, but they would have me in reserve, the sensible, quiet consolation prize, should the sunbeam prove too bright for his shadowed world. I retreated to the library, my only sanctuary. It was a room of magnificent decay, smelling of leather and dust and the slow, sweet rot of paper. Here, I was not plain Eleonora. I was a traveler of worlds, a student of histories, a silent confidant to poets and philosophers. I ran my fingers over the spine of a worn copy of Marcus Aurelius, the leather cool and smooth beneath my touch. I had always believed my life would be lived within these walls, a quiet spinster aunt, fading gracefully among the forgotten stories. The thought had never brought me despair, only a sense of calm inevitability. But now, that quiet future was being wrested from me, replaced by a cold, transactional existence beside a man who was a stranger, a monolith of grief who would likely never see me at all. I would simply be a part of the architecture of his lonely house, another silent fixture in the gloom. He arrived on a Tuesday, under a sky the color of slate. The Duke's carriage was a lacquered black box, drawn by 4 matching grays that steamed in the damp air. He descended from it not like a man, but like a force of nature, tall and severe, dressed in immaculate black broadcloth that seemed to absorb the meager light. He moved with a heavy, deliberate grace, his face a mask of aristocratic ennui, his eyes shadowed and unreadable. My father and Julian greeted him with a desperate, brittle bonhomie, their smiles stretched thin over their panic. Rosamond was presented, a vision in pale blue, her curtsy a perfect fluid gesture of grace. She was a porcelain doll on a velvet tray, offered up for his consideration. I stood behind them, near the door, a footnote to the grand introduction. And then it happened. The moment that fractured the carefully constructed script of my family's design. After his perfunctory greeting to my sister, the Duke's gaze swept the hall, a cool, assessing glance that took in the faded tapestries and the water stains on the ceiling. His eyes passed over me, and for a second I was merely part of the shabby backdrop. But then they returned. It was not a glance, not the polite sweep of a gentleman's survey, but a direct, unblinking look of such startling intensity that it felt as if a key had turned in a lock I had not known was there. He did not smile, his expression did not soften, but he saw me. In a hall where I had spent a lifetime perfecting my own invisibility, this stranger, this arbiter of our fate, looked at me, and for the first time I felt utterly and terrifyingly seen. His eyes, the color of a winter storm at sea, held mine for a breath, 2, 3, an eternity in the silent, charged space between us. Then he gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod in my direction before turning back to my father, leaving me with a tremor that had nothing to do with the chill of the great hall. The days that followed were a strange, tense play. Rosamond was instructed to charm him, to walk with him in the gardens, to play the pianoforte for him in the evenings. She did so with her usual effortless grace, but the Duke remained a remote, impenetrable fortress. He was polite, his manners faultless, but a chasm of cold air seemed to surround him, a space she could not breach with her laughter or her beauty. He would listen to her music with his eyes closed, his expression unreadable, and thank her with a formal bow that felt more like a dismissal. I watched from the periphery, cataloging his every move, his every clipped response, his every long, silent stare into the fire. He was a man encased in ice, and I felt a strange, unwelcome pang of sympathy for him, for the profound loneliness that radiated from him like a physical cold. The turning point came on the fourth day. My father, attempting to showcase the estate's meager remaining assets, began to speak of the timber yields and tenant farms, his knowledge clearly gleaned from a hasty perusal of my own ledgers. He faltered, mixing up figures, confusing acreage. The Duke's expression, already severe, tightened with impatience. It was then he spoke, his voice a low baritone that commanded the room. "Is there no one who understands the practical management of this estate?" My brother Julian, ever the opportunist, began to speak, but the Duke's gaze had already found me where I sat mending a tapestry in the corner. "Perhaps Miss Eleonora?" he said, the words not a question but a quiet assertion. "I have been told the household accounts are in your purview. I assume that extends to the estate itself." My father sputtered. Rosamond looked bewildered, but a command from the Duke of Blackwood was not to be defied. I was summoned, my mending set aside, and led to the library. The great oak table was cleared, and I was instructed to bring my ledgers. The heavy books, filled with my neat, precise script, were laid out between us. A wavering partition of gold from the afternoon sun slanted across the table, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. For the first time, we were alone, save for the silent, watching portraits of my ancestors. I expected him to be dismissive, to treat me as a clerk. Instead, he pulled out a chair for me himself, a gesture of unexpected courtesy. "Show me," he said simply, his storm-gray eyes fixed on the open page. And so I did. I spoke of crop rotation, of drainage issues in the East Meadow, of the cost of repairing the tenants' roofs, of the dwindling income from the old quarry. My voice, usually so hesitant in company, grew steady and sure as I navigated the familiar territory of facts and figures. He listened, truly listened, his head bent over the ledgers, his questions sharp, intelligent, and insightful. He did not speak of my family's debt. He did not speak of marriage. He spoke to me as an equal, a peer in the world of pragmatic concerns. We talked for hours, the sun sinking lower, bathing the room in a warm, honeyed light. We were no longer a duke and a potential bartered bride. We were two minds engaged in a shared problem, a complex puzzle of land and legacy. In that dusty library, surrounded by the ghosts of forgotten books, I felt more myself than I ever had in the glittering drawing rooms where my sister shone. A fire had been lit in the hearth against the evening chill, but the library was a vast, drafty space. I shivered, a small, involuntary tremor, and tried to suppress it. He noticed immediately. Without a word, he rose and walked to a large armchair near the fire where a thick woolen shawl had been left. It was a deep forest green, soft and heavy. He brought it back and, with a startling gentleness, draped it over my shoulders. His fingers brushed the nape of my neck, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt of warmth through me that had nothing to do with the wool. "You will take a chill," he said, his voice softer than I had ever heard it. He returned to his seat as if nothing of consequence had occurred, but for me, the world had shifted on its axis. It was an act of simple, human kindness. And kindness, I knew, was a currency far more dangerous than coin, for it often came with invisible invoices. I clutched the shawl, its warmth seeping into my skin, and felt a treacherous, unfamiliar hope begin to bloom in the barren landscape of my heart. Our meetings in the library became a daily ritual. Rosamond was relieved of her duties as hostess, and she seemed more relieved than slighted, content to return to her embroidery and her correspondence. My family watched this new development with a mixture of confusion and cautious optimism. Julian saw it as a sign his plan was working, that the Duke was simply assessing the full value of his purchase, myself included. My father was merely glad that the Duke was occupied and not demanding immediate payment. They did not understand the nature of our conversations. We rarely spoke of personal matters. Instead, we fell into long, deep discussions sparked by the books around us. We debated philosophy, argued points of agricultural science, and traced the lineage of kings through leather-bound histories. He had a mind as sharp as honed steel, but it was tempered with a deep, contemplative melancholy that I found myself wanting to understand. One afternoon, we were searching for a particular volume on ancient Roman architecture. We reached for the same book on a high shelf, our hands meeting over the worn spine. His fingers were long and cool, and they closed gently over mine for a moment before he withdrew. The air between us grew thick and still, charged with an unspoken current. "Eleonora," he said, his voice low and rough. It was the first time he had used my Christian name. The sound of it on his lips was both a shock and a strange sort of homecoming. "I must apologize. My presence here, under these circumstances, is unpardonable." I looked at him, truly looked at the man behind the ducal coronet and the wall of grief. I saw the weariness in his eyes, the fine lines of strain around his mouth. "You are here because my father's folly brought you here, Your Grace," I replied, my voice quiet but firm. "There is no need for apology." He looked away, toward the window where the late afternoon light was beginning to fade. "My wife," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "She loved places like this, old houses with history in their bones. She would have adored this library." It was a small crack in his armor, the first glimpse of the wound he carried. I did not offer platitudes or empty condolences. I simply stood beside him in the fading light, sharing the silence, a silent acknowledgement of a grief I could not comprehend, but could, in some small way, honor with my quiet presence. He seemed to appreciate it. After a long moment, he turned back to me. "Alistair," he said, "if we are to be colleagues in the restoration of this estate, I would ask you to call me Alistair." The intimacy of his name was a seismic event. It was a bridge across the chasm of our respective stations, a quiet declaration that what was growing between us was something other than a business transaction. But even as this fragile connection bloomed, the shadow of my family's scheme loomed over me. Was his kindness genuine, or was it the careful cultivation of an asset? Was this intellectual communion a prelude to a marriage of convenience, one he had already agreed to with my father? The doubt was a cold stone in my stomach. I cherished our time together, the way he looked at me when I made a point he had not considered, the rare, fleeting smile that would touch his lips when I found a passage in a book that amused him. But I could not forget the reason he was here. I was the lamb being led to a gilded, lonely slaughter, and I had begun to care for the man holding the knife. The crisis arrived, as crises often do, in a folded piece of paper. It was a letter from my father's solicitor, delivered by a mud-spattered courier. My father, being indisposed after an evening with his brandy, had left it on his desk. My hand trembled as I picked it up, my name written on the outside in the solicitor's spidery script. I knew I should not open it, but a dreadful premonition seized me. This concerned me. This was about my fate. With fumbling fingers, I broke the seal. The legal language was dense and unforgiving, but the meaning was brutally clear. It was a draft of a marriage contract. It explicitly tied the forgiveness of my father's entire debt to my marriage to the Duke of Blackwood. It named me, Eleanora Vance, as chattel, as the final payment, the closing of the account. It stated that upon our union, the lands and house would be ceded to the Duke, and a small, insulting annuity would be provided for my family. The words swam before my eyes. The kindness, the shared laughter over a dry historical text, the warmth of the shawl, the touch of his hand, the sound of his name, it all curdled into a well-orchestrated lie. I was a fool. A naive, bookish fool who had mistaken a predator's patience for a gentleman's respect. He was not seeing me. He was appraising me. He was not connecting with my mind. He was ensuring his new possession was not an imbecile. The cold fury that washed over me was a foreign sensation. I had spent my life in quiet resignation, but this calculated deception was an insult I could not swallow. I felt the brittle shell of the quiet, accommodating Eleanora crack and fall away, and in its place was a woman forged in the cold fire of betrayal. I found him in the library, of course, our sanctuary. He was standing by the window, staring out at the rain-lashed gardens, his tall frame a dark silhouette against the gray light. He turned as I entered, a question in his eyes. I did not speak. I simply walked to the table and laid the solicitor's letter down between us. I watched his face as he read it. I watched for the flicker of guilt, the tightening of his jaw that would confirm his complicity. To my bewilderment, his expression shifted from curiosity to a dark, simmering anger. A muscle worked in his jaw, but it was not the clench of a man caught in a lie. It was the fury of a man who had been betrayed himself. He looked up from the paper, his eyes blazing with a cold fire I had never seen. "Did you believe I had a hand in this vile document?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. The pain of my own wound made me reckless. "What else was I to believe?" I retorted, my voice shaking with suppressed rage. "That your sudden interest in the plain sister was a coincidence? That your kindness was anything other than the polishing of a tarnished bauble before its purchase? You knew of the debt. You knew why you were here." I was breathing heavily, the words torn from a place of deep hurt. I had allowed myself to hope, and the fall from that precipice was agonizing. "Yes," he said, and the single word was a blow. "I knew of the debt. I came here to foreclose on a property owned by a man I knew to be a fool and a degenerate gambler. He stepped closer, his intensity a physical force that pinned me in place. I came here expecting to deal with greedy, desperate men. I came here prepared to take what was legally mine and be done with it. What I did not plan for, he continued, his voice dropping, growing thick with an emotion I could not name, was you. He stopped before me, so close I could see the flecks of silver in his storm-gray eyes. I did not plan for your mind, for your quiet strength, for the way you see the world. I did not plan for the only honest thing I have found in this entire damnable house, to be a woman who believes me to be a monster. He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew another set of folded papers, placing them on the table beside the wretched marriage contract. This, he said, his voice raw, is a document I had my own solicitor draw up 2 days ago. It is a proposal to your father. It restructures his debt into a manageable loan, secured by a portion of the estate he would retain. It allows him to save face and keep his home. It has absolutely no conditions attached. No mention of marriage. No mention of you. He looked at me, his face a mask of pained sincerity. I did it because the thought of you being homeless, of you being cast out because of your father's incompetence was intolerable to me. I did it because I could not bear to be the instrument of your ruin. I stared at the documents, my mind reeling. The 2 papers lay side by side, one a contract that sold me, the other a contract that saved me. My anger began to recede, replaced by a profound and dizzying confusion. I looked up at him, searching his face for the truth. What I saw there undid me. The iron mask was gone. In its place was a vulnerability so stark, so profound, that it felt like an intrusion to witness it. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, terrified of the fall. "Eleonora," he said, his voice breaking on my name. "The grief I have carried. It built walls around me so high and so thick, I thought nothing would ever penetrate them again. I lived in a gray, silent world. And then I met you. You did not try to flatter me or charm me or fill the silence with meaningless chatter. You simply were. You met my mind with your own. You saw the man and not the Duke. You have, piece by piece, dismantled my defenses without even trying. You have brought color back into my world." He took a slow, deep, and shaking breath. "I find that I am in your every thought. The idea of living the rest of my life without our conversations, without the quiet peace of your presence, is a thought I can no longer endure. The contract your father proposed is an obscenity. But I will not lie to you. I want to marry you, not to settle a debt, not to acquire an estate, but because I believe my heart, which I thought had died, has somehow remembered how to beat again because of you." It was a confession so stripped of artifice, so raw and honest, that it left me breathless. This severe, guarded, powerful man was laying his scarred heart at my feet. The hope I had so viciously tried to extinguish moments before surged back, fierce and overwhelming. I saw the truth of it in the tormented sincerity of his eyes. My own feelings, which I had suppressed and denied, rose to the surface. The respect I had for his mind, the comfort I found in his presence, the warmth that bloomed in my chest at his small kindnesses. It was not just gratitude. It was something deeper, something quieter, something that felt terrifyingly like love. "I accept," I whispered, the words feeling inadequate for the magnitude of the moment. His eyes widened slightly. You accept the restructuring of the debt?" he asked, as if not daring to hope for more. A small, watery smile touched my lips. "No, Alistair," I said, speaking his name with a new and wonderful sense of possession. "I accept you." The relief that washed over his face was like watching the sun break through a storm. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he gently cupped my cheek, his thumbs stroking my skin. The touch was reverent, hesitant, as if he were touching something impossibly precious. We stood there, in the quiet of the library, the two damning and redeeming documents lying forgotten between us, our own contract forged not in ink and law, but in a shared, vulnerable truth. Our alliance was sealed. We would face my family and the world together. The confrontation, when it came, was not of our making. Julian, enraged that his carefully laid plans were unraveling, forced the issue. At the annual autumn assembly in the local village, a grand affair for our small county, he cornered us near the refreshment table. The entire society of our small world was present, their eyes drawn to the drama unfolding around the formidable Duke of Blackwood and the Vances. My brother's face was flushed with wine and fury. "Your Grace," he began, his voice loud enough to carry, "I believe we have a matter of a contract to finalize." My father grows impatient. "Eleonora has played her part well, but it is time to make the arrangement official." He was trying to shame Alistair into compliance, to trap him publicly. He was trying to paint me as a conniving seductress who had lured the Duke away from the more suitable Rosamond. A hush fell over the room. I felt 100 pairs of eyes on me, their gazes a mixture of pity, scorn, and morbid curiosity. For a moment, the old Eleonora, the girl who faded into the wallpaper, wanted to flee. But then I felt Alistair's hand find mine, his fingers lacing through my own, a firm, steady anchor in the churning sea of public opinion. His presence was a silent promise of support, and it gave me strength. Alistair did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His quiet authority was more powerful than Julian's blustering rage. "There seems to be a misunderstanding, Mr. Vance," he said, his tone glacial. "The only contract I am aware of is the one I offered your father 2 days ago, a generous renegotiation of his debt, which, I might add, he has yet to respond to." He produced the document from his coat, holding it up for the nearest gossips to see. "As for any other arrangement, I can assure you no such thing exists. I would never engage in a transaction that treats a human being as property." Julian's face went from red to a pasty white. "You deny it? You deny the agreement?" "Father!" he called out, spotting our father hovering nervously near the doorway. "Tell him! Tell them all of the agreement we made." But my father, a man defined by his moral cowardice, simply shrank back into the shadows, unwilling to face the public scorn of the Duke. It was then that I found my voice. I stepped forward slightly, my hand still held firmly in Alistair's. "There was no agreement, Julian," I said, my voice clear and steady, carrying across the silent room. "There was only a shameful scheme, hatched by you and Father to sell me to settle your debts. You underestimated His Grace's honor, and you underestimated me." I looked at my brother, not with anger, but with a kind of weary pity. "For my entire life you have seen me as a burden, a plain and quiet fixture to be ignored, or, when it suited you, to be used. You never once thought to ask what I wanted. You never once saw me as a person with a mind and a heart of her own." I turned my gaze to the assembled crowd. "I am not a bargaining chip. I am not a line item in a ledger. My worth is not determined by my face or my dowry, but by my character. And my character," I finished, turning back to look up at Alistair, whose eyes were shining with a fierce pride, "is something His Grace the Duke of Blackwood has seen fit to value." The social defeat was absolute. Julian stood there, speechless and exposed, his desperate, greedy plot laid bare for all to see. My father had already slipped away. Rosamond, who had been watching from across the room, looked at me with a new, dawning respect in her eyes. The whispers that started were not of my supposed entrapment, but of my family's disgrace and the Duke's unimpeachable integrity. In that moment, standing before the society that had always overlooked me, I was no longer invisible. I was seen, I was heard, and I was free. We left the assembly shortly after, the whispers and stares following us out into the cool, crisp night air. Alistair led me not to his carriage, but into the formal gardens behind the assembly hall, where the moonlight silvered the edges of the boxwood hedges. We walked in silence for a long time, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath our feet and the distant strains of the orchestra. He led me to a stone bench overlooking a small, placid pond, the water a sheet of dark glass reflecting the starry sky. He did not release my hand. "You were magnificent," he said finally, his voice filled with a quiet awe. He turned to face me, his other hand coming up to cup my face, just as he had in the library. "You have more courage and integrity in your little finger than your brother and father have in their entire beings." I leaned into his touch, a sense of profound peace settling over me. The turmoil of the past weeks, the fear and the betrayal and the uncertainty, had all been burned away in the crucible of that public confrontation, leaving only a quiet, shining truth. "I only spoke what was true," I whispered, "and you gave me the strength to speak it." "Eleonora," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I meant every word I said in the library. I want to spend the rest of my life having conversations with you. I want to see your face across the breakfast table. I want to watch our children inherit your intelligence and your quiet grace. I want to build a home with you, not of stone and mortar, but of trust and respect and a love I never thought I would feel again." He searched my eyes in the moonlight, his own gaze raw and open. "Will you marry me, Eleonora Vance?" "Not for any reason but that we have, against all odds, found each other." Tears welled in my eyes, but they were tears of joy, of a happiness so profound it felt like a physical ache in my chest. "Yes," I breathed. "Oh yes, Alistair. Yes." That was all he needed. He leaned in, closing the small distance between us, and his lips met mine. The kiss was not a fiery explosion of passion, but something far deeper, far more meaningful. It was a kiss of homecoming, of promises kept and futures beginning. It was gentle and sure, a sealing of the pact between two lonely souls who had found their harbor in one another. It was slow and deep and shaking with the relief of a long-sought truth finally claimed. In the quiet moonlight of an English garden, I, the plain, overlooked daughter, was finally, irrevocably home. We were married 3 weeks later, in a small, private ceremony in the ancient chapel at Blackwood Manor. It was a day of soft autumn light and quiet joy. My sister, Rosamond, was there. In the wake of our family's public disgrace, something had shifted between us. She had come to me, her eyes filled with a contrite shame, and apologized for a lifetime of careless superiority. She was humbled, and in that humility we found a fragile, tentative sisterhood that had always eluded us. She found a respectable, if not brilliant, match with a country gentleman soon after, and I believe she was far happier for it. My father and Julian retreated to a small rented house in Bath, their pride and their prospects shattered. I did not pity them, I simply let them go. My new life was nothing like the cold, transactional existence I had feared. Blackwood Manor was not a mausoleum. It was a grand, beautiful house that had been waiting for a gentle hand to bring it back to life. And Alistair was not a monolith of grief. He was a kind, thoughtful, and deeply passionate man whose laughter, once he rediscovered it, was the most wonderful sound I had ever heard. We filled the house with books and warmth and the quiet hum of a shared life. Our days were spent in companionable silence in the library or in long walks across the moors, our conversations meandering from estate business to ancient poetry. Our nights were filled with a tenderness and an intimacy I had never dared to dream of. One evening, months into our marriage, Alistair came into my study and placed a small, crudely carved wooden horse on my desk. I gasped. It was a little toy my grandfather had carved for me when I was a child, a trinket I thought had been lost years ago during one of my family's many financial upheavals. "I found it in a box of your old books that were sent over from your father's house," he said softly. "I thought you might want it." I picked up the small horse, its wood worn smooth by a child's hands, and my heart swelled. It was a forgotten piece of me, a symbol of a lonely childhood he had not been a part of, but still took the care to find and restore to me. It was just one of 1,000 small, thoughtful gestures that defined the man I had married. He had not just saved me from ruin. He had seen me, all of me, from the intelligent woman who managed ledgers to the quiet child who had treasured a little wooden horse. I stood and walked to him, wrapping my arms around his waist and resting my head against his chest. I felt his arms come around me, holding me securely. We stood there for a long time, watching the fire dance in the hearth, two souls no longer adrift, but anchored firmly together. I had begun my story by being appraised like an object, a solution to a debt. But I had ended it here, in the arms of a man who valued my mind, cherished my heart, and honored my past. Life, I had learned, was not about waiting to be seen by the world, but about finding the one person who sees you so clearly that you are finally able to see yourself. And in the quiet, steady beating of his heart against my ear, I knew, with a certainty that settled into the very marrow of my bones, that I had been found.